Woman disrespects veteran at Arlington Cemetery on Veterans Day, unaware who is behind. Laura checked her phone again, scrolling through her packed itinerary for the day. The Lincoln Memorial, the National Mall, the Smithsonian, her list seemed endless, and here she was, stuck at Arlington National Cemetery. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she pulled her jacket tighter, wondering if she could skip this stop altogether. But her mom would definitely ask about it, and Laura didn't want to deal with another lecture about appreciating history. Groups of people moved past her, their faces solemn and purposeful. Laura couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal about today. Sure, it was Veterans Day, but wasn't that just another holiday? Another day off work? The guy at her hotel had acted like she was committing some kind of crime when she'd asked if any good stores would be open. She followed the winding paths between the endless rows of white headstones, each one identical to the next. Her boots crunched on the fallen leaves, and the sound seemed too loud in the quiet atmosphere. The sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain, which would definitely mess up her schedule. Laura pulled out her phone to check the weather app, almost bumping into an older couple who had stopped suddenly in front of her. "Sorry," she mumbled, stepping around them. They barely noticed, their attention fixed on something ahead. Laura looked up from her screen to see what the holdup was. A small crowd had gathered near one of the graves, forcing her to stop. Great, just great. She'd planned to get through this part of her trip in 30 minutes tops, but at this rate, she'd be here forever. Through gaps in the crowd, she could see an elderly man in a military coat that had seen better days. His movements were slow and deliberate as he arranged flowers by a headstone. The wind rustled the petals, and he carefully adjusted them, making sure they stayed in place. His hands shook slightly, but there was a precision to his actions that seemed important somehow. Laura shifted her weight from one foot to the other, checking the time again. She had restaurant reservations for lunch at this cute place her friend had recommended, and she still needed to figure out how to get there. The metro system was confusing, and she'd already gotten lost twice since arriving in DC yesterday. More people were gathering now, creating a sort of impromptu audience for the old veteran's private moment. Laura couldn't understand why everyone was being so dramatic about it. Sure, it was sad that people died in wars and everything, but wasn't that just how things went? Her own grandfather had served in Vietnam, but he never made a big deal about it. He barely talked about it at all, actually. The cold was starting to seep through her boots, and Laura bounced slightly to keep warm. She considered just turning around and finding another path, but something about the scene in front of her made her pause. The old man's face was lined with years, but there was something in his expression that caught her attention. He wasn't crying or making any big show of emotion, but there was a weight to his presence that seemed to affect everyone around him. A woman standing near Laura dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and Laura resisted the urge to roll her eyes. It seemed like everyone was getting caught up in the moment, except her. She watched as the veteran straightened up slowly, his joints probably protesting the movement. His coat had medals pinned to it, their bronze and silver surfaces dulled with age. Laura wondered briefly what they were for, but quickly dismissed the thought. She had places to be, things to see. Real things, not just a bunch of old graves and sad people. Still, she found herself staying put, her feet rooted to the spot despite her mind telling her to move on. The cemetery stretched out in every direction, a sea of white markers under the gray sky. Each one, she knew somewhere in the back of her mind, represented a person, a life, a story. But right now, they were just obstacles in her way, things to walk past on her way to somewhere more interesting. The old veteran reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a coin maybe? He placed it carefully on top of the headstone, his weathered fingers lingering on the stone for a moment. Laura couldn't see his face clearly from where she stood, but something about his posture spoke of a deep connection to whoever lay beneath that marker. The crowd had grown larger while Laura wasn't paying attention. People seemed to materialize from other paths, drawn to the quiet ceremony taking place. Some wore uniforms, others regular clothes, but there was something similar in the way they carried themselves. They moved with purpose, with understanding, as if they were all part of something Laura couldn't quite grasp. She found herself studying their faces, noticing details she might have missed if she'd been rushing past like she'd planned. A young man in dress blues stood ramrod straight, his face carefully composed, but his eyes never leaving the elderly veteran. A middle-aged woman in a worn leather jacket had her hand over her heart, a small American flag pin catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. Laura's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another text from her friend asking if she was on her way to lunch yet. She ignored it, surprising herself. The scene before her had taken on a different quality, like a photo slowly coming into focus. The headstones no longer looked like identical white markers, but instead seemed to hold their own presence, their own gravity. The elderly veteran was still standing by the grave, but now he seemed to be whispering something. The words weren't meant for anyone else, and the wind carried them away before they could reach the gathered crowd. Laura found herself wondering what he was saying, what memories he was sharing with the silent stone. A child in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve, asking in that loud whisper that kids use when they're trying to be quiet, "Mom, why is that man talking to the stone?" The mother bent down, explaining in soft tones about remembrance and honor, about keeping memories alive. Laura caught fragments of the conversation, words about sacrifice and duty floating past her like leaves in the wind. She thought about her own grandfather again, remembering how he'd sit in his favorite chair, staring at nothing for hours sometimes. When she was little, she thought he was just being boring, but now, watching this elderly veteran, she wondered if maybe her grandfather had been seeing something else entirely during those quiet moments. The sky had darkened further, and Laura felt the first tiny drops of rain on her face. Nobody in the crowd moved to leave, or even opened an umbrella. The veteran didn't seem to notice the weather at all, his attention still fixed on the headstone in front of him. Water beaded on his coat, running down the dull metals that suddenly seemed to shine a bit brighter. Laura's carefully planned schedule was definitely shot now. She should have been halfway to the Lincoln Memorial by this point, checking off another item on her tourist to-do list. Instead, she stood in the growing rain, watching a stranger pay tribute to another stranger, surrounded by people who seemed to understand something she'd been missing. The drops grew larger, more insistent, but the silence remained unbroken except for the soft patter of rain on leaves and stone. Laura realized she'd stopped checking her phone, stopped thinking about where she needed to be next. Time felt different here, measured not in minutes and hours, but in memories and moments of silence. More people were arriving, their footsteps hushed on the wet grass. They joined the circle naturally, without discussion or direction, as if they'd always known where to stand. Laura found herself taking a small step forward, drawn into the growing congregation, without really meaning to. The old veteran's private moment had become something larger, something that seemed to connect everyone present in ways Laura couldn't quite explain. She noticed an older woman walking with a cane making her way slowly toward the gathering. Without thinking, Laura stepped aside to make room for her, helping her find a spot where she could see clearly. The woman smiled in thanks, and Laura noticed she wore a pin similar to the one on the veteran's coat. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or an understanding that Laura was finally beginning to grasp the weight of this place, this moment. The rain continued to fall, gentle but persistent, like tears the sky couldn't quite hold back. Laura's hair was damp now, her carefully planned outfit probably ruined, but for the first time since arriving at Arlington, she didn't care. Her tourist checklist seemed trivial compared to the ceremony unfolding before her, a ceremony she had almost dismissed as a waste of time. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, and Laura's feet were starting to ache in her wet boots. She'd been standing in the same spot for what felt like forever, watching this impromptu gathering grow larger by the minute. Her stomach growled, reminding her of those lunch reservations she'd definitely missed by now. The restaurant had been pretty clear about their strict cancellation policy, and she'd probably lost her deposit. The thought of wasted money made her irritation spike. This wasn't even part of her original plan. She'd only added Arlington to her itinerary because her mom had insisted it was important. Important seemed to be her mom's favorite word lately, especially when it came to telling Laura what she should be doing with her life. The elderly veteran was still by the grave, seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd around him. He'd pulled something else from his pocket, a small photo, maybe, though Laura couldn't see it clearly through the rain. Whatever it was, he studied it with such intensity that it made Laura uncomfortable, like she was witnessing something too personal, too raw. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, shifting her weight again. Her toes were definitely numb now, and her jacket wasn't nearly waterproof enough for this weather. The crowd had created a bottleneck on the path, forcing other cemetery visitors to either wait or find another route. A line was forming, people pausing to watch the ceremony before moving on. Laura checked her phone again, grimacing at the time. She'd planned to hit at least 3 more tourist spots before dinner, and now everything was getting backed up. Without thinking, she spoke louder than she'd intended, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "We're all waiting around for one guy." The words seemed to hang in the damp air, sharper and uglier than she'd meant them to be. A woman standing next to her turned, her face a mask of shock and disapproval. She was older, maybe in her 60s, wearing a dark blue raincoat with a small pin on the lapel that matched the ones Laura had been seeing all morning. "Young lady," the woman began, her voice low but intense, but Laura cut her off with a dismissive shrug. She didn't need another lecture, especially not from a stranger. But something made her glance back at the elderly veteran, and her breath caught in her throat. He was standing straighter now, his posture military precise despite his age, and though he hadn't turned around, something in the set of his shoulders made Laura wonder if he'd heard her comment. Other people nearby were giving her side eyes now, creating a small bubble of space around her. Laura felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin defiantly. They were the ones making a big deal out of nothing, turning a simple cemetery visit into some kind of production. She had places to be, things to do. Real things, not just standing in the rain staring at stones. But even as these thoughts ran through her head, something else nagged at her. The elderly veteran moved slightly, adjusting his stance, and Laura caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were fixed on the headstone, but there was something in his expression that made her stomach twist. It wasn't sadness, exactly, or at least not just sadness. There was a depth to it that made Laura think of old photographs, the kind that seemed to hold entire worlds in their faded images. She remembered finding a box of her grandfather's old military photos once, tucked away in the attic. She'd been looking for Christmas decorations and had opened it by mistake. The pictures were black and white, showing young men in uniforms, smiling at the camera. Her grandfather had walked in while she was looking at them, and for a moment, his face had held the same expression she now saw on the elderly veterans, a look that seemed to bridge past and present, joy and grief, memory and loss. Her grandfather had quietly taken the box from her hands that day, and she'd never seen it again. She'd almost forgotten about it until now, standing in the rain at Arlington, watching another old soldier lost in his memories. The woman next to her was still watching her with disapproval, but Laura barely noticed anymore. Her attention was caught by the way the veteran's hands moved over the headstone, tracing letters she couldn't read from where she stood. The rain was falling harder now, drops rolling down Laura's neck and soaking into her collar. She should move, find shelter, or at least try to salvage what was left of her sightseeing schedule. But something kept her rooted to the spot, a strange mixture of shame and curiosity that she couldn't quite shake off. More veterans had joined the gathering, their presence changing the atmosphere in subtle ways. They moved differently than the tourists and casual visitors, with a kind of contained energy that reminded Laura of big cats at the zoo, powerful but controlled, aware of every movement. Some wore uniforms, others civilian clothes, but they all seemed to share an unspoken understanding, a connection that transcended the need for words. Laura's phone buzzed again in her pocket, probably another message from her friend about lunch.
She didn't check it this time.
The screen would just remind her of all the things she was missing, all the carefully planned activities that were slipping away while she stood here in the rain. But somehow, those plans felt less important now, like a child's drawing left out in the rain, the colors running and blending until the original image was barely recognizable. The elderly veteran had finished whatever private ceremony he'd been performing. He straightened up slowly, his movements careful but deliberate, like someone handling something precious and fragile. Laura noticed that his coat, despite its aged appearance, was perfectly pressed, the metals aligned with military precision. She wondered how long it had taken him to get ready this morning, to prepare for this moment. A younger veteran, maybe in his 40s, stepped forward from the crowd, offering a steadying arm as the elderly man turned away from the grave. Their interaction was brief, but loaded with meaning, a quiet exchange of nods that seemed to say more than words could. Laura found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't have explained why. Her earlier comment felt like a stone in her stomach now, heavy and sharp-edged. She wanted to take it back, to somehow erase it from the air, but words didn't work that way. They lingered, like the rain, seeping into everything they touched. The disapproving woman had moved away, but Laura could still feel the weight of her judgment, mixing with her own growing sense of discomfort. Someone in the crowd started humming softly, a melody Laura didn't recognize, but that seemed to resonate with the veterans present. A few others joined in, the sound building slowly, weaving through the patter of rain on stone. Laura watched as the elderly veteran's shoulders tensed slightly, then relaxed, as if the music had touched something deep inside him. She thought again of her grandfather, of all the questions she'd never asked him. He'd passed away 3 years ago, and she'd been too busy with college to visit much in his final months. Her mom had tried to get her to come home more often, telling her that time was precious, that some things were more important than midterms and parties. Laura had brushed her off, promising to visit during spring break. But spring break had come too late. The humming grew stronger, and Laura recognized it now. It was the song they'd played at her grandfather's funeral. She'd been standing under another gray sky then, watching as they folded a flag with precise, practiced movements. She hadn't cried. She'd been too numb, too disconnected from the ceremony that it seemed like something from another world, another life. But now, watching the elderly veteran stand among his companions, surrounded by the markers of fallen soldiers, Laura felt something crack inside her. The tears came suddenly, mixing with the rain on her face. She blinked rapidly, hoping no one would notice, but when she looked up, she found the elderly veteran looking directly at her. His eyes were kind, understanding, and somehow that was worse than any judgment or disapproval. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her earlier rudeness or her current tears. He simply looked at her with eyes that had seen more than she could imagine, then turned back to the gathered veterans. Laura stood there, rain soaking through her expensive jacket, her carefully planned day in ruins, and felt something shift inside her. The cemetery was no longer just a tourist stop on her itinerary. It had become something else, something she was only beginning to understand. Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, grateful that the rain disguised her tears. She took a step backward, intending to slip away from the gathering before anyone else noticed her emotional state. Her feet squished in her wet boots as she moved, but before she could retreat further, she noticed movement on the surrounding paths. More people were coming, emerging from between the rows of headstones like shadows taking form. They moved with quiet purpose, their footsteps barely audible on the wet grass. Some walked with canes, their steps careful but determined. Others stood straight and tall in pressed uniforms that seemed to shed the rain. A woman about Laura's mom's age helped an elderly veteran navigate the slick path, her arm linked protectively through his. Laura found herself caught in the gentle flow of people, unable to leave without pushing past them. The crowd was different from the usual tourist groups she'd dodged all morning. There was no chatter, no phones held up for photos, no children whining about being bored. Instead, there was a sense of shared purpose that made Laura feel like an intruder in a private moment. A man in his 60s stopped near her, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. Without thinking, Laura shifted to make room for him, noticing the way he favored his left leg. He nodded in thanks, and she saw the same kind of pin on his jacket that she'd been seeing all morning. Up close, she could make out its design, some kind of unit insignia, she guessed, though she didn't know enough to identify it. The elderly veteran who had started all this was still standing near the headstone, but now he seemed less alone. Others had moved to stand beside him, forming a loose semicircle that somehow didn't feel staged or artificial. They moved with the easy familiarity of people who had stood together before, who understood without words where they should be. Laura watched as a young woman in dress blues approached the group. She couldn't have been much older than Laura herself, but she carried herself differently, with a kind of grounded confidence that made Laura feel suddenly young and foolish. The young servicewoman took her place in the gathering with practiced ease, and Laura noticed how the older veterans acknowledged her, not with words, but with slight nods and subtle shifts that made space for her among them. The rain had settled into a fine mist now, creating halos around the cemetery's lampposts. Laura's tour schedule was completely ruined at this point. She should have been halfway through the National Mall by now, checking off famous monuments from her list. Instead, she stood rooted to this spot, watching as more veterans joined the growing assembly. Each new arrival seemed to bring their own story, written in the way they moved, the medals they wore, the scars some of them carried. A group of older men helped another veteran from his wheelchair to stand among them, their movements practiced and gentle. Laura noticed how they positioned themselves subtly around him, ready to offer support if needed, but giving him the dignity of standing on his own. She thought about how she'd complained this morning about having to walk so much. Her feet were cold and wet, sure, but watching these veterans, some with obvious injuries, others moving stiffly from age or old wounds, made her discomfort seem trivial. The man next to her shifted his weight on his cane, and Laura saw him wince slightly, though he made no sound. The elderly veteran who had been placing flowers turned slightly, and Laura could see his face more clearly now. The kind eyes that had met hers earlier were now distant, focused on something or someone that only he could see. His lips moved slightly, as if he was having a conversation that no one else could hear. The other veterans watched him with understanding, some of them nodding as if they knew exactly what he was saying in his silence. More veterans continued to arrive, each adding to the growing sense of ceremony. Laura noticed how they greeted each other, not with the usual handshakes and hellos, but with subtle gestures that seemed to carry deeper meaning. A hand on a shoulder, a quiet nod, a shared glance that spoke of shared experiences. She felt like she was watching a language she didn't speak, but could somehow understand. A slight breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the sweet, earthy smell of wet grass and fallen leaves. The sound of traffic from beyond the cemetery walls seemed muted now, as if the gathering had created its own pocket of silence. Laura found herself breathing more slowly, matching the quiet rhythm of the moment. An older woman in a dark coat made her way through the crowd, her silver hair neatly arranged despite the dampness. She carried herself with dignity, and Laura noticed that several of the veterans straightened slightly as she passed, offering small nods of respect. She moved to stand near the elderly veteran, and something in their shared silence made Laura think they might have known each other for a long time. The man with the cane beside Laura cleared his throat softly, and she glanced over to see him watching the pair by the headstone. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his expression was one of profound respect rather than sadness. When he noticed Laura looking, he spoke quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Some bonds never break." It was the first words anyone had spoken in what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been that long. Laura wanted to ask what he meant, but something told her that would break the spell that seemed to hold everyone in this moment. Instead, she nodded, trying to show that she understood, even though she knew she couldn't really comprehend the depth of what she was witnessing. The gathering had taken on a life of its own now, growing beyond the simple act of one man paying his respects. Laura watched as veterans of different ages, races, and backgrounds found their places in the loose circle, each adding their presence to the unspoken ceremony. Some wore medals that caught the gray light, while others wore only small pins or nothing at all to mark their service. But there was something in the way they carried themselves that set them apart. A young man in civilian clothes stood near the back of the group, and Laura noticed he kept touching something in his pocket, probably a coin or medal, she thought, remembering how her grandfather used to do the same thing with his old dog tags. The young man's face was a study in contained emotion, as if he was trying to maintain his composure, but finding it increasingly difficult. The elderly veteran turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the gathered faces. When his eyes met Laura's again, she felt a jolt of recognition. Not because she knew him, but because she suddenly understood something about the weight of memory, about the way the past could reach into the present and change everything. She thought about her rush morning, her irritation at the crowds, her dismissive comments, and felt a deep shame that had nothing to do with being caught or judged. The silver-haired woman had placed her hand on the elderly veteran's arm, a gesture so gentle it was barely visible. But Laura saw how his shoulders relaxed slightly, how some of the tension seemed to leave his face. Around them, the other veterans maintained their respectful distance while somehow managing to convey a sense of unwavering support. Laura's phone had stopped buzzing in her pocket. She wasn't sure if the battery had died or if her friends had finally given up trying to reach her. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Her carefully planned itinerary, her tourist checklist, her desire to see everything and miss nothing, it all seemed shallow now, like trying to capture the ocean in a paper cup. The mist had turned the air silver, softening the edges of the headstones that stretched endlessly in every direction. Laura noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of silence that made her stand a little straighter. Through the crowd, she saw someone new approaching, a young serviceman in dress blues, carrying something that caught the gray light. It was a bugle, she realized, its brass surface gleaming despite the dim day. The servicewoman moved with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and precise. The gathered veterans seemed to sense his approach without turning, their postures changing almost imperceptibly. Laura watched as spines straightened, shoulders squared, heads lifted, small adjustments that transformed the loose gathering into something more formal. The elderly veteran by the headstone remained still, but Laura saw how his hand had moved to rest lightly on the stone, as if drawing strength from its solid presence. The silver-haired woman had stepped back slightly, giving him space while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. Around them, the circle of veterans had shifted, creating a natural path for the bugler to take his position. Laura's throat felt tight as she watched the young serviceman raise the instrument to his lips. There was a moment of perfect stillness, where even the rain seemed to pause, hanging suspended in the air. Then the first note of taps cut through the silence, clear and pure and heartbreaking. The sound seemed to reach inside Laura's chest and squeeze. She'd heard the song before, of course, at her grandfather's funeral, at ceremonies on TV, but never like this. Here, surrounded by veterans standing at attention, with the mist swirling around countless white headstones, the melody carried a weight she'd never felt before. The man with the cane beside her had straightened as much as his injury would allow, his right hand raised in a crisp salute. Laura saw that his eyes were fixed straight ahead, but tears ran freely down his weathered cheeks. Around her, other veterans had done the same, their salutes sharp and precise regardless of age or physical limitation. Even those who couldn't raise their arms fully maintained the dignified bearing that marked them as service members. The notes floated across the cemetery, each one perfect and painful. Laura watched the elderly veteran by the headstone, saw how he stood perfectly still except for a slight tremor in his extended hand. The silver-haired woman behind him had her eyes closed, her face turned slightly upward as if accepting the rain as tears she couldn't shed herself. Laura found herself holding her breath between the notes, afraid that even the sound of breathing might somehow intrude on this moment. The young man with the bugle played with deep respect, each note given its full measure of time, allowing the sound to fully fade before beginning the next. His precision spoke of hours of practice, of understanding exactly what this moment meant to those around him. Through the music, Laura became aware of movement at the edges of her vision. More people had appeared, drawn by the sound of taps echoing through the cemetery. They stopped where they were, showing proper respect for the ceremony taking place. A mother pulled her young son close, whispering something in his ear that made him stand straighter, his small face serious as he watched the gathered veterans. The melody wound its way toward its conclusion, each note seeming to carry years of memory, of loss, of honor. Laura thought about all the times the song had been played in this place, how many ceremonies like this had taken place among these same stones. She thought about her grandfather again, remembering how he used to get quiet whenever military songs played on TV, how he'd turn away and busy himself with something else until the music ended. The final notes of taps hung in the air, fading slowly into the misty silence. None of the veterans lowered their salutes immediately, holding the position as the last echoes dissolved into the rain. Laura noticed how even those who seemed to be struggling with a pose didn't waver, their commitment to showing proper respect overriding any physical discomfort. When they finally did lower their hands, the movement was synchronized without any signal being given. The elderly veteran by the headstone remained at attention for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on something distant. Then, slowly, he relaxed his posture, though he maintained the dignified bearing that seemed as much a part of him as breathing. The young bugler lowered his instrument with the same precision he'd shown in playing it. Laura saw that his eyes were red, though his face remained composed. He took a step back, becoming part of the circle rather than its focus, but the weight of what he'd just done seemed to linger in the air around him. Laura became aware of a soft sound. At first, she thought it was just the rain, but then she realized people were speaking quietly, murmuring names under their breath. The veterans near her were doing it too, their lips moving almost imperceptibly as they recalled those they'd lost. The man with the cane whispered something that might have been Jimmy, his voice rough with emotion. The elderly veteran turned from the headstone now, facing the gathered crowd for the first time. His face was wet, and Laura couldn't tell if it was from rain or tears. It didn't seem to matter. The silver-haired woman moved to his side again, her presence steady and supportive. Laura noticed how their hands found each other without looking, the gestures speaking of years of shared grief and understanding. More veterans were speaking now, their voices creating a gentle murmur that reminded Laura of waves on a beach. Names and fragments of memories drifted past her. Best friend I ever had. Never forget that day. Saved my life in '68. The words weren't meant for her, weren't meant for anyone really, just quiet affirmations that these memories were still alive, still honored. The young woman in dress blues who had arrived earlier stepped forward, placing something small and bright on the headstone. A coin, Laura realized, like the one she'd seen the elderly veteran leave earlier. Others followed suit, approaching the grave one by one to leave their own tokens. Some left coins, others touched the stone briefly. A few stood for a moment with their hands pressed flat against the marble, as if trying to reach through it to the person below. Laura watched this new ceremony unfold, understanding that she was witnessing something both deeply personal and universally human. Each person who approached the headstone seemed to carry their own weight of memory, their own reasons for being there. Yet they were all connected by something larger than their individual stories. The rain had almost stopped now, though water still dripped from the trees that lined the cemetery paths. Laura's clothes were soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but she barely noticed the discomfort anymore. Her world had narrowed to this moment, to these people, to the understanding that was slowly dawning in her heart. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching the moisture in the air and creating a brief rainbow over the gathered veterans. Several people looked up, and Laura heard a few soft exclamations. The elderly veteran smiled for the first time since she'd seen him, a gentle expression that transformed his entire face. The silver-haired woman squeezed his hand, and he nodded, as if they were sharing a private joke or memory. The rainbow faded as quickly as it had appeared, but something had changed in the atmosphere. Laura felt it in her chest, a growing awareness that made it hard to breathe. She watched the elderly veteran's face, seeing how the brief smile had softened the deep lines of grief without erasing them completely. For the first time, she really looked at him, not just as an obstacle in her tourist schedule, but as a person carrying decades of memories. Her mind flashed to news clips she'd seen over the years. Young soldiers in dusty uniforms, military helicopters against desert skies, flag-draped coffins being carried off planes. She'd always changed the channel, feeling vaguely uncomfortable, but never really stopping to think about what those images meant. Now, standing among these veterans, those disconnected fragments of media coverage began to take on human form. The man with the cane beside her shifted his weight, wincing slightly, and Laura found herself wondering about his story. How old had he been when he served? What had he seen? Who had he lost? She thought about her own life. Her biggest worry this morning had been making it to lunch on time, and felt almost dizzy with the contrast. A younger veteran near the front of the gathering caught her attention. He stood perfectly still, his posture military straight, but his hands were clenched at his sides. As she watched, an older veteran placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and the young man's fingers slowly relaxed. No words were exchanged, but Laura saw how the simple gesture seemed to anchor him, pulling him back from whatever memory had gripped him. She remembered a documentary she'd half-watched in history class, something about Vietnam. There had been interviews with veterans, talking about friends they'd lost, about moments that had changed them forever. She'd been texting under her desk during most of it, more concerned about weekend plans than decades-old conflicts. Now those ignored voices came back to her, carrying new weight and meaning. The elderly veteran had moved slightly, adjusting something on the headstone, the photo he'd placed there earlier, Laura realized. From her position, she could just make out the edge of what looked like a group shot, young men in uniform smiling at the camera. The image was faded, its edges worn smooth from years of handling, but the veteran touched it with such care that Laura felt her throat tighten again. Around her, the gathered veterans maintained their respectful silence, but their presence seemed to fill the space with unspoken stories. Some wore uniforms that spoke of recent service, while others had medals that hinted at conflicts Laura had only read about in textbooks. She noticed how they stood together, old and young, their differences bridged by something deeper than she'd ever understood. The silver-haired woman had moved to speak quietly with another veteran, and Laura caught fragments of their conversation. Something about a unit reunion, about members who couldn't make it this year. Their voices were low, but Laura heard the undercurrent of loss, the careful way they spoke around names that still held too much pain to say aloud. A distant rumble of thunder made several veterans glance up at the sky, and Laura saw how some of them tensed at the sound. The man with the cane took a deep breath, his knuckles white on the polished wood. Without thinking, Laura shifted slightly closer to him, offering silent support the way she'd seen the other veterans do. He gave her a quick, grateful look, and she realized that sometimes the smallest gestures could carry the most meaning. The clouds were gathering again, darker now, but nobody moved to leave. Laura watched as the elderly veteran reached into his coat pocket once more, this time pulling out what looked like a set of dog tags. The metal caught what little light remained, flashing dully as he held them for a moment before placing them carefully beside the photo on the headstone. The sight triggered another memory, finding her grandfather's dog tags in his dresser drawer after he passed away. She'd picked them up, wondering about the numbers stamped into the metal, but had put them back without really understanding what they represented. Now she wished she'd asked him about them, about the people he'd served with, about all the things he'd never talked about. A young servicewoman in dress blues stepped forward, her movements precise but gentle. She placed a small American flag next to the dog tags, adjusting it so it stood straight despite the wet ground. Laura noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she stepped back, though her face remained composed. Another veteran, older, with gray in his beard, reached out to squeeze her shoulder as she returned to her place in the circle. The gesture reminded Laura of all the times she'd seen similar scenes in movies or TV shows, soldiers supporting each other, fighting together, grieving together. She'd always thought it looked a bit dramatic, maybe even exaggerated for effect. Now she understood that if anything, those portrayals fell short of the reality she was witnessing. Rain began to fall again, heavier than before, but the veterans seemed oblivious to it. Their focus remained on the elderly veteran and the headstone he stood before, on the small collection of tributes gathering there, coins, flags, photos, dog tags, each item placed with purpose and meaning. Laura realized that what she'd initially seen as just people standing around was actually something far more profound, a living memorial, a bridge between past and present. The man with the cane had begun whispering something so quietly that Laura could barely hear him over the rain. It sounded like a list of names, each one spoken with careful respect, as if the simple act of saying them aloud could keep their memory alive. Around him, other veterans had bowed their heads, some adding their own whispered names to the quiet litany. Laura thought about her own name, about how many times it had been spoken in worry or love or anger or joy. She thought about the names on these headstones, each one representing not just a person but a whole web of relationships, friends, family, fellow soldiers. The endless rows of white markers suddenly seemed insufficient. To contain so many stories, so much life and loss. A sharp crack of thunder made several people jump, and Laura saw how quickly the other veterans moved to support those who seemed most affected. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just immediate, understanding response to need. She thought about all the times these men and women must have supported each other in much worse circumstances than a thunderstorm. The elderly veteran turned slightly, and Laura caught his expression, a mixture of grief and pride so intense it made her want to look away. But she forced herself to keep watching, feeling that she owed him at least that much respect. His face held decades of memory, of friendship, of loss, of survival. She thought about how many times he must have stood at similar headstones, how many friends he had said goodbye to over the years. The silver-haired woman moved to stand beside him again, and Laura saw how naturally they fit together, two people who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. The woman's presence seemed to steady him, though Laura noticed that when she reached for his hand, it was hard to tell who was supporting whom. The words formed in Laura's throat, "I'm sorry," but they stayed there, stuck behind a knot of emotion she couldn't swallow down. Her earlier comment about waiting around seemed to echo in her memory, each word sharp with thoughtless disrespect. She took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, suddenly aware of how inadequate any apology would be in this moment. The elderly veteran was still standing by the headstone, his presence like an anchor in the storm. Laura watched as he adjusted his coat, the movement revealing more medals than she'd initially noticed. Each one, she realized, probably held its own story, its own weight of memory. She thought about how carelessly she dismissed him earlier, seeing only an old man holding up traffic on a busy path. Thunder rolled again, closer now, and Laura saw several veterans flinch at the sound. The man with the cane beside her had gone pale, his jaw clenched tight. Without thinking, she moved slightly closer to him, offering the same silent support she'd seen others give. He gave her a quick nod of thanks, and she noticed his hand had relaxed slightly on the cane's handle. The rain was falling in sheets now, but nobody moved to leave. If anything, the veterans seemed to stand straighter, as if their presence here was more important than any physical discomfort. Laura's expensive jacket was completely soaked through, her carefully styled hair plastered to her face, but for the first time all day, she didn't care about her appearance. She took another small step forward, trying to find the courage to approach the elderly veteran. Words tumbled through her mind, explanations, apologies, questions, but none of them seemed right. How do you apologize for not understanding something you should have known? For treating sacred ground like just another tourist stop? For rushing past memory and sacrifice in your hurry to get to lunch? The silver-haired woman caught her movement and turned slightly, her eyes meeting Laura's. There was no judgment in her gaze, just a deep understanding that made Laura's chest tight. The woman gave her a small nod, almost encouraging, but Laura remained frozen in place. She thought about her grandfather again, about all the things she'd never said to him, all the questions she'd never asked. A young veteran near the front of the gathering shifted slightly, making space in the circle, creating a path that Laura could take if she chose to. The gesture was subtle but clear, an invitation to step forward, to become part of this moment rather than just an observer. Laura felt tears mixing with the rain on her face as she considered taking that step. The elderly veteran was speaking softly now, his words carried away by the wind and rain before Laura could catch them. But she saw how the other veterans reacted, heads bowing slightly, hands clasping together, bodies turning subtly toward his voice as if drawn by the gravity of his words. She wondered what he was saying, what memories he was sharing with these people who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. The man with the cane had begun whispering again, a quiet litany of names that seemed to blend with the sound of the rain. Laura caught fragments, Johnny from Basic and Doc Williams, and other names that clearly meant something deep to him. She stood still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might interrupt this private moment of remembrance. Laura's feet felt heavy as lead as she contemplated moving forward. The gap in the circle remained open, inviting, but the weight of her earlier disrespect held her back. She watched as another veteran stepped forward to place something on the headstone, a small medallion that caught the gray light. The simple action carried such reverence that Laura felt her throat tighten again. The elderly veteran turned slightly, and for a moment, his eyes met hers across the gathering. There was no accusation in his gaze, no lingering hurt from her thoughtless comment. Instead, she saw something that made her heart ache. Understanding, as if he could see right through her current shame to the person she was trying to become in this moment. Lightning flashed in the distance, and Laura counted the seconds until the thunder followed, something her dad had taught her to do when she was little. The sound, when it came, was softer now, the storm moving away. She noticed how the veterans had braced for it, how they'd drawn closer together without seeming to move at all. Words of apology formed and died on her lips several times. Everything she could think to say seemed hollow, inadequate against the depth of what she was witnessing. How do you apologize not just for one thoughtless comment, but for years of not understanding, not trying to understand? For treating places like this as items to check off a tourist list? The silver-haired woman moved slightly, her hand still linked with the elderly veterans, and Laura caught a glimpse of something on her wrist, a bracelet with a name and date. Another memory, another loss carried through the years. Laura thought about her own jewelry, chosen for fashion rather than meaning, and felt a fresh wave of shame at her superficiality. A young serviceman in dress blues shifted position, accidentally bumping into Laura. His quiet, "Excuse me, ma'am," was automatic, respectful, and Laura found herself straightening instinctively in response. She noticed how he carried himself, the same quiet dignity she'd seen in all the veterans gathered here. She wondered what he'd seen in his service, what memories he carried beneath his composed exterior. The elderly veteran had turned back to the headstone now, his free hand resting lightly on its wet surface. Laura saw his lips moving and realized he was having a private conversation with whoever lay beneath the marble marker. The other veterans maintained their respectful distance, creating a space for this intimate moment while remaining steadfastly present. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and breaks in the clouds allowed weak sunlight to filter through. Laura watched as the light caught the water droplets on the medals and pins worn by the gathered veterans, creating tiny prisms that seemed to hold all the stories she'd never bothered to hear, all the sacrifices she'd taken for granted. Her phone had been silent for hours now, probably dead from the rain. Her carefully planned itinerary, her lunch reservations, her tourist checklist, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Standing here, soaked to the skin among these veterans, Laura felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what it meant to remember, to honor, to respect. The words of apology remained unspoken, but something else was happening, a quiet transformation that went deeper than words could express. Laura stood straighter, letting the rain wash away her former self, the thoughtless tourist who had arrived at Arlington seeing only stones and schedules instead of stories and sacrifice. The elderly veteran turned away from the headstone with a final, gentle touch to its surface. His movement seemed to release something in the gathered crowd, a collective breath held too long. As he faced the group, his eyes found Laura's again, and this time, she didn't look away. His gaze held a depth of understanding that made her want to stand taller, to be worthy of the kindness she saw there. He made his way slowly through the gathering, veterans stepping aside respectfully to let him pass. The silver-haired woman stayed close, but Laura noticed she let him move under his own power, respecting his dignity even while being ready to help if needed. As he drew closer, Laura felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. When he reached her, he paused. Up close, she could see the years etched in his face, but his eyes were clear and sharp. The medals on his coat told stories she couldn't read, but suddenly wished she could understand. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave her a small nod. Not of forgiveness, exactly, but of recognition. As if he saw something in her that she was only beginning to discover in herself. First time at Arlington? His voice was quiet but steady, carrying easily despite the pattering rain. Laura found herself nodding, words stuck in her throat. He smiled slightly, the expression softening the military bearing he carried. It has a way of teaching us things we didn't know we needed to learn. The simple statement hit Laura like a physical force. She thought about her morning, about checking Arlington off her list between breakfast and lunch, as if it were just another tourist attraction. The veteran's words captured exactly what had happened to her, a lesson she hadn't known she needed, hadn't even known she was missing. Around them, the other veterans maintained a respectful distance, but Laura could feel their presence, solid and supportive. The man with the cane had moved slightly closer, and she noticed how the others had adjusted their positions, unconsciously creating a smaller circle that included her. The gesture brought fresh tears to her eyes. "My grandfather," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "He served in Vietnam." I never asked." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but the elderly veteran nodded as if he heard everything she couldn't say. His eyes held a mixture of understanding and something deeper, not quite sadness, but a recognition of all the conversations that never happened, all the stories left untold. "They carry us with them," he said softly, gesturing to the headstone he'd been visiting. "And we carry them. That's what this place is about. Not just remembering, but carrying forward." His words seemed to ripple through the gathered veterans, drawing quiet nods of agreement. Laura saw how some of them touched their medals or pins as he spoke, small gestures of connection to memories they carried. The rain had almost stopped now, though water still dripped from the trees surrounding them. Laura became aware of how the light had changed, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds to cast long shadows across the rows of white markers. The cemetery seemed different now, no longer just a field of stones, but a living repository of stories, of connections, of sacrifices both given and received. The elderly veteran studied her face for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small and metallic, a challenge coin, Laura realized, recognizing it from a display she'd rushed past in the visitor center that morning. He held it out to her, the metal warm despite the cool day. "Sometimes," he said as she hesitantly took the coin, "the best way to honor those we've lost is to learn from those who remain." His words carried no judgment for her earlier behavior, no criticism of her former ignorance. Instead, they offered a bridge between who she had been this morning and who she was becoming now. The coin felt heavy in her palm, its surface etched with symbols she didn't understand but suddenly wanted to learn about. She noticed how the other veterans watched this exchange with approval, some nodding slightly as if confirming a decision they'd all silently made. The silver-haired woman stepped forward, her hand still linked with the elderly veterans. "We come here to remember," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "but also to teach. Every story shared is a thread connecting past to present." She looked at Laura with eyes that seemed to hold decades of both joy and sorrow. "Sometimes the most important lessons find us when we least expect them." Laura closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its edges press into her palm. She thought about her grandfather again, about all the stories she'd never heard, all the memories he'd carried alone. The weight of the coin seemed to connect her to something larger than herself, something she was only beginning to understand. The man with the cane shifted beside her, drawing her attention. "We all start somewhere," he said quietly, nodding toward the coin in her hand. "What matters is where we go from here." His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned through years of service and sacrifice. Around them, the gathering had taken on a different quality. The formal ceremony had evolved into something more personal, more intimate. Veterans spoke quietly among themselves, sharing memories and stories. Laura noticed how they included her in their circle now, not as an outsider, but as someone who had begun to understand. The elderly veteran squeezed the silver-haired woman's hand once before releasing it. He reached out and patted Laura's shoulder, the gesture both grandfatherly and military precise. "Take your time here," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Really look, really see. That's how we honor them." Laura nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked out across the cemetery, seeing it with new eyes. Each headstone was no longer just a marker but a story, a life, a collection of memories carried by those left behind. The neat rows seemed to stretch endlessly, each one holding tales of courage, sacrifice, and love that she had never stopped to consider. The sun broke fully through the clouds now, casting a warm golden light across the wet grass. Laura watched as the elderly veteran made his way back to the headstone, his steps slow but purposeful. The other veterans parted to let him pass, their respect evident in every movement. She realized she was witnessing not just a ceremony or a gathering, but a living connection between past and present, between those who served and those who remembered. The gathering began to disperse slowly, naturally, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Veterans moved in small groups, some heading deeper into the cemetery to visit other graves, others making their way toward the exits. But there was nothing hurried about their departure. Each person took time to share a word, a handshake, a knowing look with others before leaving. Laura stood still, the challenge coin warm in her palm, watching as the elderly veteran made one final adjustment to the items on the headstone. The silver-haired woman waited patiently beside him, and Laura noticed how their shoulders touched slightly, offering silent support. The scene struck her as deeply intimate, a moment of connection that transcended the physical world. Her phone was definitely dead now, soaked through from hours in the rain. Somewhere in the city, her friend was probably wondering what had happened to her, why she'd missed their lunch plans, why she wasn't answering texts. Hours ago, that would have sent Laura into a panic of apologies and explanations. Now, it seemed almost trivial compared to what she'd witnessed here. The man with the cane was preparing to leave, and Laura felt a sudden urge to thank him for his quiet presence throughout the ceremony. But when she turned to speak, she found he was already looking at her, a gentle understanding in his eyes. "Remember this," he said simply, gesturing not just at the gathered veterans, but at the entire cemetery. "This is what matters." She nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate. He gave her a small smile and began making his way down the path, his cane leaving small marks in the wet grass. Other veterans nodded to her as they passed, including her in their farewells as if she'd been part of their group all along. The young servicewoman in dress blues paused briefly beside her. "You know," the servicewoman said, her voice soft but clear, "sometimes the hardest part isn't the loss, it's learning how to carry it." She touched the medals on her uniform unconsciously, a gesture Laura had seen many others make throughout the day. "But we carry it together. That's what makes it bearable." Laura thought about her grandfather's funeral, how she'd stood apart from the other mourners, checking her phone, thinking about getting back to campus for midterms. She wished she could go back to that day, stand closer to her family, listen to the stories being shared, understand the weight of what was being carried by those around her. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving everything looking somehow cleaner, more vibrant. Water droplets clung to the headstones, catching the late afternoon light like countless tiny prisms. Laura watched as sunlight played across the medals on the departing veterans' uniforms, creating brief flashes of brilliance against the somber backdrop. As the crowd thinned, Laura found herself taking a few steps toward the headstone where everything had begun. The elderly veteran and the silver-haired woman were still there, but they too were preparing to leave. The veteran was speaking quietly to the stone, his words too soft for Laura to hear, but she understood now that she was meant to. Some conversations were private, meant only for those who shared the deepest bonds. She looked down at the challenge coin in her hand, really studying it for the first time. The metal was worn smooth in places, evidence of being carried and handled over many years. Unit insignias and dates were etched into its surface, each one representing stories she might never know but could now respect. She slipped it carefully into her pocket, knowing it would never be just a souvenir. The elderly veteran turned away from the headstone finally, his hand lingering for a moment on its smooth surface. When he looked at Laura, his eyes were clear despite the emotions she knew he must be feeling. "Coming here," he said, his voice steady. "It's not about death. It's about life. The lives they lived, the lives they saved, the lives they changed. Remember that." Laura nodded, feeling the weight of the coin in her pocket, like a physical reminder of this lesson. The silver-haired woman touched her arm gently as they passed, the gesture somehow conveying both understanding and encouragement. Laura watched them make their way down the path. The veteran stepped slow but purposeful, his companion matching his pace perfectly. The cemetery was quieter now, most of the day's visitors having left. Laura stood alone by the headstone, reading the name and dates carved into the marble. Below them were words about service and honor, but she found herself thinking more about the stories behind those formal phrases, the friendships formed, the sacrifices made, the memories carried by those left behind. Her carefully planned itinerary lay in ruins, but Laura couldn't bring herself to care. She thought about all the things she'd wanted to see today, monuments, museums, tourist attractions, and realized that none of them could have taught her what she'd learned here among the headstones and heroes. As she finally turned to leave, Laura noticed other small groups scattered throughout the cemetery, veterans and families visiting their own special graves, carrying their own memories. She walked slowly now, taking time to really look at the markers she passed, wondering about the stories each one held. Her footsteps crunched softly on the wet gravel, a quiet rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds, creating patterns that seemed to connect one headstone to another, one story to the next. Laura reached into her pocket and touched the challenge coin again, feeling its edges press against her fingers. She thought about how she'd carry this day with her, how it would change the way she saw not just Arlington, but everything that came after. At the cemetery gate, she paused and looked back. The rows of white markers stretched into the distance, each one catching the golden light differently. She thought about her grandfather, about the elderly veteran, about all the men and women who had served and sacrificed. She thought about the stories they carried, the memories they honored, the lessons they taught to those willing to learn. Laura stepped through the gate, leaving Arlington behind but carrying something new within her, an understanding that some things couldn't be rushed, some moments couldn't be scheduled, and some lessons could only be learned when you were ready to receive them. The challenge coin pressed against her heart where she'd moved it to her jacket pocket, a permanent reminder of the day she'd learned to stop, to see, and finally, to understand.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.